So this time around, I want to talk about some topics that might be considered a little spicy. We hear a lot about player agency. Sometimes it's even the main emphasis of a video. But what does that really mean? And what is the difference between player agency and character agency? And how do both of those relate to the concept of narrative control? We want to talk about these three things in this particular video, and I'm going to do that through the context of a few different blog articles that I've read recently that made me kind of push this back up towards the top of the list of videos that I wanted to produce. However, it's been on my mind since the beginning of the year. This really kind of goes back to I have to preface this with the standard disclaimer of I'm not trying to criticize the way other people choose to play. As far as I'm concerned, if you're regularly gathering a group of people around a table, whether virtually or in person, and you're enjoying the process of playing these games with those other people, then you're getting it right, and that's all you really need to worry about. But some of us like to break down the minutiae and talk about it. And so this kind of video is a place to start that discussion. So I don't really expect to have any definitive answers as far as what's right for you. I can really only tell you what's right for me, or what I do as far as my means and methods and my rationale for doing these things at my table. So to get the ball rolling, I think that we kind of need to, at least for the purposes of discussing these topics in this particular video, agree on some definitions for things like agency and narrative and, by extension, narrative control. So with agency, we're really always and only talking about the capability to act or make decisions that are meaningful in the sense that the outcome is changed by the decision that's made. Now, we're always talking about kind of these individual acts, and again, that includes speech acts and their impacts on the outcomes, how they influence or affect the outcomes following those decisions, what ensues from those decisions. And so we also have to accept that just because somebody has made a decision with a particular intent, that does not mean that the consequences of making that decision with that intent are always going to follow expectation. There can always be unintended consequences. And that kind of will go back to the first blog article that we'll talk about, and we'll cultivate more discussion about that. Now, we also want to talk about narrative, and I didn't do an on-screen graphic for that, so just briefly, when we're talking about narrative, we're talking about the textual recounting of events in a particular order and from a particular perspective. So you might think about the voiceover narrator being the perspective, or if you're getting access to the internal dialogue of a character within that particular story, then that's your narrator. There's all sorts of addendums to that, or addenda to that. The unreliable narrator then becomes a thing where you can't necessarily trust what the narrator is telling you. We kind of get past all that, just accept that it's a retelling. So when I say a textual retelling, I don't just mean the written form of text. I also mean spoken text, that things are verbalizable, that they are articulable in terms of an abstract language, and that they can be related between a transmitter and a receiver, between a person transmitting the message and a person receiving the message, through the use of language. And so then when we get to narrative control, what we're really talking about is really any time that a person or thing other than the player character, and we're using Monte Cook's definition here, introduces something that affects the outcome of that decision. That if that individual had not acted thusly, then events would have unfolded differently from there. And for Monte Cook, in the article that we'll talk about after the first article, Actually, that'll be the third article. You'll see that he kind of suggests that narrative control is different from player agency, and I mean player agency, not character agency. However, I would say that narrative control is a form of player agency. Because it's a decision being introduced by the player or potentially agency. So the distinction between just narrative control and when it overlaps with player agency would be when the thing that the player introduces into the shared imagined setting actually has a noticeable, detectable impact on the outcome of events from there. It meaningfully and substantively changes the outcome of events because it was introduced. If you just sort of, put some random object in there because you needed a pen on top of a desk. Well, desks often do have pens, and that probably isn't going to meaningfully change the course of the narrative following the introduction of that pen. That might be just an example of purely narrative control, that you've added a pen sitting on top of a desk. If, however, that pen did influence the outcome of events beyond just the picking up and using of the pen, then that might also be an example of player agency, because it is the player that has, through a speech act, introduced that pen on that desk within the shared imagined setting. So the first of the blog articles that inspired me to make this video now was brought to my attention recently on the video I did about how to have fun playing D&D. One of the commenters on that video introduced me to a blog site that's written by someone called the Angry GM, and I will put a link to that article down in the video description. However, I would really suggest going and checking out that person's blog, reading some of their articles. I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with everything they say, but I do, from what I saw, and I haven't read through everything, there's somebody who has given a lot of deep introspection and thought about these games and why we're playing them, what we hope to get out of them, what we're doing with them, and they also are able to articulate their position very well and in an entertaining way. So I think if you aren't already familiar with that, and probably most everybody is, I was probably the last one to hear about it, I would say go and check out their more articles than just the one I linked to down below. But I think they mentioned in this article about meaningless fun and indulgent crap. And what we're talking about in this sense is that in the older style of games that I generally play, and I don't spend as much time playing the newer games, or haven't thus far, or the newer games that I play are all sort of geared more towards the older style play experience. I find that a lot of people are really just talking about themselves through the vehicle of their character, and I've even heard it explicitly stated that the setting doesn't really matter. It's really just this backdrop that's intended to service the immediate demands of the character or characters being controlled by the players. So if they have this, I call it, if I can dream it, I can do it mentality towards play, if it's something that seems like a neat idea and that springs into their head as part of the scene they're playing out collaboratively with the other players, then they feel like they ought to be able to introduce that, and it's all contributes to the story. If it doesn't break the world, if it doesn't break the adventure, then any problems can be ironed out with just additions to the narrative from that player or the other players. And it's really about keeping the flow of this collaborative narrative they're creating going and having fun with it. And there you go. That's the buzzword right there. If you're having fun with it, well, then that's fine. If your GM or the whole group isn't developing the background world to an extent where you know a lot of details about it, then that's fine. What I'm saying is that I really feel like where there is a posited fantasy world, where there is this sort of shared imagined setting with a fair amount of detail behind it, that when you're coming up with your character's background story, when you're positing these actions taken by your character, including speech acts, things that your characters are saying in these scenes, they should be tied to things that you know about the world. So if there are established quote facts about the world, then you should honor them and have the players be bound, or have the characters be bound by that. Now we're starting to talk about where character agency comes in. So when we talk about the character's agency, we're still going to be talking about decisions that they make that affect outcomes. And if they hadn't made those decisions, if they hadn't acted in such a way, then the outcome would have been different. Events would have unfolded differently from the way they do post making that decision. But that needs to be fully contextualized for the character within that shared imagined setting. So rather than something that people, well, it just sounded cool, so I wanted to, throw that in there so we could have fun with it. I'm not saying don't do things that sound cool. I'm just saying that it should be based on that character's bounded knowledge of its own situation and its understanding of how it can best accomplish its own goals within that established context. So it needs to be rooted in that shared imagined setting. It needs to be collaboratively, all of us need to accept that these are the details of the world. And this goes back to this Angry GM article about meaningless, fun, and indulgent crap. It's saying that the older style games really always had these trade-offs. We paid for the bonuses we got from whether it was choosing to play an elf instead of a human, or the bonuses that are associated with one particular class over another, the kind of the role, the hard role that would be played by that character. Your fighter is a melee character, your cleric is a tank with healing capacity, your thief is a fast-moving, lightly armed and armored scout that can move ahead of the party. The magic user has the capacity to wildly alter the course of events or the nature of the encounter through magical intervention of powerful spells and that sort of thing. There was always this trade-off. There's always things, or that it's just bounded by the availability of resources within the world, that you don't always have access to the means to be able to carry out whatever those particular ideas are. Not that the player doesn't have access to those means, it's that the character doesn't have access to those means. So the character's decisions need to be meaningful in the sense that they need to alter the outcomes detectably and obviously to the player. They need to see that their decisions have some sort of meaning, that there are consequences to all their decisions, but that's just it. It becomes consequences. So in a lot of this kind of narratively focused and solely centered on whatever neat ideas people have about their characters, like I said, if the I can dream it, I can do it mentality, then you really don't get the sense of consequences, because what the only consequence that really counts is that the players collaboratively are enjoying the process of co-creating this narration to what is ostensibly a story, even if it's not at the time of creation, that it's not a story until they look back on it and retell it. They're still kind of, just like with a hero story or a movie or a TV show, they want to, week after week, follow the course of events where the camera is always focused on a particular character or a particular group of characters and what they choose to do in the world. And that's great, except that in a larger world, then villains are going to pop up in places where the characters are not. It's just not plausible if the big bad evil guy always just happens to arise wherever the players are, as if it was in response or a reaction to their being there. Now, if the big bad evil guy does in fact arise as a reaction to the players being there, then it does make sense. But in a world it is itself meaningful, where the world has its own agency and decisions made by non-player characters within the world are based on what they understand about that world and the flow of events and the nature of reality in that posited fantasy world, then things are going to arise at a great distance from the characters, and it may not be until weeks, months, or years later that they've heard these things happen, as much as it would be true in our own world. Of course, this day and age with the internet and television and whatnot, we hear about things much faster, but put yourself back 150, 200 years ago, where the news traveled much more slowly, and that's a lot more similar to the situations with at least the fantasy medieval type of role-playing game, where they have access to obviously magical means of transmitting information over long distances and that sort of thing, but that's not available to most people. It's certainly not available to most of the common people. Maybe your nobles or people who are themselves professionals within the sphere of magical influences might have more immediate access to that kind of long distance communication sort of thing. But that's a dangerous tool to give them. Realize it easily could be as dangerous as the overpowered +5 magical sword with extra spell-like abilities. That immediate access to knowledge, if it's especially paired with immediate access for transportation, can really override a lot of what are essentially the challenges and obstacles that you expect the characters to have to meet to get themselves into a position where they can confront their adversary. And now that kind of brings me into the second blog article that's kind of motivated me to make this video now. And this one I'm not going to link to because it does kind of sound like I'm being critical of it. And I don't want to, as they say on the internet, start beef with anybody. And especially because I'm really not criticizing the way their group chooses to play. If that's, in this case, not what they enjoyed, if it didn't meet their needs, well, then they do need to revisit their procedures. But it is another small content creator here on YouTube, and that's the other reason why I really don't want to, on one hand, it might drive traffic to them, which I think would be a good thing. On the other hand, I don't want to drive critical traffic towards them. So if that person recognizes the story and they want to speak out, I'm more than happy to talk about it, and then I would link to you. But the blog story that I read was kind of starting at a point where the party had been involved in some sort of large altercation, some sort of physical fight, and they had, through with great difficulty and through concentration of effort and using all of their abilities, managed to win the fight. And then the big bad evil guy was present at the battle, but rather than then giving the party an opportunity to defeat them, their game master simply had the big bad evil guy steal their means of transportation and use it to depart from the scene, so that the players or their characters were never given the opportunity to confront the big bad evil guy at the end of a battle that they won. And the person writing this article used that as an example of denial of player agency. Now, admittedly, I don't know everything that went into that circumstances before that battle occurred, or what the expectations of the players were after that battle. That might have been the end of their campaign, and so they never got a chance. But I would say that's really not an example of denial of agency. It's just that the choices the characters made up until that point were good choices for them to win the skirmish, win the battle, but not the war, I guess is going to be the moral of this story, because they defeated the henchmen, the foes, the opponents arrayed before them, before the big bad evil guy, the boss monster, came out. And they made good decisions to win that battle, but they weren't then in a position to stop the big bad evil guy from stealing their own means of transportation and using that to escape, rather than staying on the scene and providing them with an opportunity to overcome that big bad evil guy. But they can always then track down the big bad evil guy in the next session, right? That would just be where the story should go from there. And they're going to continue to, both as players and as characters, have to make decisions that put them on the trail of that big bad evil guy, and hopefully recover their means of transportation as well. And so that's what I mean about contextualizing things within the shared imagined setting so that they make sense. There's this whole world out there full of people who have their own goals and their own means and bids, and they're all making their own choices based on what they know about that positive fantasy world and their ability to act within it in ways that they think are to their advantage. Now, that just because they make decisions, meaning the non-player characters in this case, that doesn't mean it's always going to go swimmingly for them. They may receive unintended consequences to their actions as well. So that's an experience that's, it should be equally allocated, these sort of intended consequences. In other words, you shouldn't, as a GM, have a bias in favor or against any of the outcomes. You need to just kind of, as fairly as you possibly can, in an unbiased way, as much as you possibly can, figure out, well, okay, if you made that decision, or if that non-player character made that decision, here's the way things would shake out from that. And just as honestly with yourself as well as your players as possible, try to make what you contribute to that collaborative narration fit what you think would be the circumstances of them having made that decision. So you're, in that sense, not adversarial. You're just kind of fairly adjudicating outcomes based on what you know about the world, what you know about the persons, in this case non-player characters, how they would make decisions, what their background of knowledge is, what they would perceive as available to them as far as courses of action. Now, I think that brings us then back to the Monte Cook article, which is the last article, and that's another one that I will link to down in the description. And I've more or less covered all the territory in it, except that I do disagree with Monte Cook about some aspects of it, and I've already talked about. I feel that narrative control, just simply putting things into the setting, can be player agency, and I've already given that distinction. If it changes the outcome substantively, then you probably have, an example of player agency as well, not necessarily character agency, and that becomes that second distinction. Because the Monte Cook article, when you go and read it, he often talks about player characters as the term, and when you read it in the context of the article, you should understand that what he's actually talking about is what we're here calling character agency. So going back to our definition for narrative control, we're talking about when anyone or anything introduces something into the shared imagined setting that alters the outcome, and it's other than the player characters, is what he says in the quote. What he means is what we're talking about here as character agency. So if it's something that the character, and here I think we should be talking about non-player characters as well, introduces into the world based on their own bounded rationality, their knowledge of their own limitations, as well as the limitations of rules and resources available to them in the world, then we're still within the realm of character agency. It's the character's decisions that are being made and reflected by the ongoing course of events within the adventure, whether or not there's any story to it or whether the story will grow out of it in its retelling. And so anyway, then just to wrap this up, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about it in the context of a thought experiment that I did with a friend of mine. I was out visiting a friend of mine a few weekends ago, and she has no background whatsoever in tabletop fantasy role-playing games, or any kind of role-playing game for that matter. And we just really kind of got on the topic of, I was making videos, and it was for, D&D style content, and why was I doing that? And she kind of had some curiosity about how such a thing would be played. And so we started just coming up with some scenarios. I would say, okay, well, you're walking down the road, and you see there's trees on either side, and up ahead you see a clearing. Now, stop right there for a second. Now, I really, as the GM, have no right to tell the player what they do or don't see. And that's a criticism that I hear from the highly character narrative focused kind of game players. That you shouldn't put words in their mouth. Maybe they don't see the clearing. Well, maybe they didn't see the trees. Maybe they didn't know it was a road. Maybe they didn't see or know a lot of things. But I think we kind of have to accept that there's a bit of a shorthand going on where the GM is acting as the sensory apparatus, the sensoria of all the players. So you kind of have to gauge what they would most likely be able to see, hear, smell, taste, feel, kind of thing. And if then the player wants to use their agency to say, ooh, yeah, but I'm looking that way, so I haven't seen it yet. Well, that's fine. We can kind of retroactively affect the continuity that way without really any major damage being done to again, it doesn't break the story in the world. So that goes the opposite way as well. Let the players exert their agency sort of after the fact or as the facts are ongoing. If they want to, contravene a statement made by the DM, then that should be perfectly allowable, to some extent. I didn't feel the dragon swiping at my face. That might not be the place where you could actually assert that kind of player agency, that kind of influence. But within reason, we'll say, then you should be able to, kind of retroactively say, well, no, I didn't do that, or I didn't see that. But by the same token, you don't want to strong arm players. I mean, it's fine to describe a scene and, slip in you can see a clearing in the trees. Anyway, to move on the thought experiment, it became a matter of, well, there's you get up there a little farther and you see there's a cabin in the clearing. And she really didn't, at this point, I hadn't come up with an idea for a goal, a particular motivation for going on this adventure kind of thing. And it was one of the things that she noted was that, she got the idea of, well, it's a wide open world and you can choose to do whatever you want, but without any kind of ideas about what goals there could be in the world, let alone should be. It was really kind of difficult to come up with ideas about, well, what actions should I take? And so even before we came up with goals, she decided to, I described the building as, there's a wooden door with an iron hand or an iron knob. There's two windows in the front of the building. It's a neatly appointed little cabin, but it's not anything special or particularly decorated or anything. It's just a sort of utilitarian cabin in the woods kind of thing. And she decided to go up and knock on the door, and I had somebody come to the door and say, "Who is it?" And she said, I'm just traveling down the road kind of thing, so the cabin wanted to stop by. And well, we don't want any visitors around here. What do you want? And her response to that was sort of, well, I'm thirsty. And she was kind of, I guess, thinking in her mind that the door would open up and the person would invite her in for a glass of water or something like that. But of course, I went a different route with it. I went, well, there's a well around back in the yard. You can go out there and have a drink. And ultimately, when we moved the story along, I'll kind of cut it short in that direction. We did decide on that the local lord had realized there was a problem with bandits operating in the woods, and that he had talked to her character about going out to find out what was going on with these bandits, and if possible, put a stop to their banditry out there, and in affecting the good citizens of his realm. Or we didn't say whether it was a male lord or female lord, but move the story along to we're talking about narrative control, player agency, and character agency. She went up back to the well, and I described the well as having a framework with a winch and a rope going down into the well. And then she said, I'll go over there and crank the winch. And I described it as there being a bucket on the other end of the rope, and that there was water coming up in the bucket. And then she she was talking about getting the drink. So she said she would reach for the ladle. And I said, oh, yeah, and that's the thing. So there's narrative control. I hadn't up to that point said that there was any sort of ladle there, but that's a common thing with a well. You have a little metal ladle by the bucket or a wooden ladle by the bucket, and then you use that to take your drink out of. But then as the bucket got up to the top, she said, and there's a skull in the bucket. And that's what I said, ooh, well, I'd kind of prefer not to go down that route. And so now we're talking about something that would be narrative control, certainly, but also an example of player agency and discussing a point that could also be character agency, because the character would actually sit and maybe gasp and say it because they saw a skull. But it's really primarily just about the player. And that's where we got in. Well, we're talking about, ways that players should or should not introduce concepts into the game. I was like, I like that you added in the ladle just by automatically stating that you'd reach for the label or ladle and use that to, get ready to drink out of the bucket when you got it up, sort of thing. Because, that makes sense that there would be a ladle there and it doesn't matter one way or the other. Now, it also in no way breaks the rules of the game. We had no story, so it's not like we had a planned story that was going the wrong way if there was a skull in the bucket. It was really at that point I had sort of introduced the idea of bandits. It could have been the bandits had defleshed the skull and thrown it down the well, but it really kind of derailed the narrative that we had shared up until that point, because that's a major detail. You find a skull in a bucket and then suddenly everybody is like, well, what are we going to do with this skull? It must be some sort of murder mystery. And that's true. If you wanted to go on that route, you could collaboratively just keep the narrative flowing in that direction and treat that skull as evidence of an old murder, or even a new one where the skull was rapidly denaturized for some reason. But just in talking about that, I was like, I'd prefer kind of not to do that. Or if you want to add that in, maybe we treat it as tentative until we kind of agree, okay, well, let's go with that. Don't have the expectation be you'll just say something like that, because it really does change the flow of the narrative when you introduce something as minor as just the skull in a bucket. And kind of asked her just in the course of talking about it was, well, why did you add a skull in there? Did you actually want to do some type of skull in the well murder mystery where you're figuring out who it was and how they got put in the well? No, she just wanted to raise the stakes of things that she was adding into the game. She added in a ladle and that was cool, so she wanted something with a little more dramatic value, and of course the skull in the bucket fit that bill. But beyond that, she really had no particular interest or expectation that any of the narrative would follow, why the skull was in the bucket, or make that a central point of the story that we were going to work on collaboratively to retell at a later date. It was fine to just kind of, well, let's not put that skull there, and we'll keep working on this bandit idea that we have. And so that was kind of again, I think the reason it works as an example was because we really were just conducting a thought exercise. It wasn't a story that either of us was committed to, or even a world that either of us was committed to. It was just an idea that we were sharing and talking about, collaboratively creating at the time. And it came to a kind of critical juncture with this concept of the skull in the bucket coming up from the well, because at that point, that's a major enough introduction that it is going to change the flow of decisions to be made after that point. And then you have to sort of, again, it's fine to deal with that collaboratively in the sort of out of character sense. Well, is this important? Do we want to keep on with this? Now, obviously, you don't want to break the action with each and every little introduction that comes in. But when it's something that's going to be a pivot point like that, when it's really going to change the direction of the game, then I think it's important to kind of have that discussion at the time, or to just allow the GM to override most details like that. And if you really feel strongly about it, then you can object and we can talk about it. But for the most part, I think if there's an established a good amount of lore and history and cultural context for a particular world, and the GM has mostly been the one providing that, then just let them kind of have that determination to keep the flow moving along. And like I said, if it is something that you feel strongly about, that you really want to introduce, well, then we can talk about that too. You can bring that up even in game. I'm not saying it has to be something that's relegated to, well, let's talk about that after or between sessions or that sort of thing. Anyway, I think that's probably enough discussion about the distinctions between player agency, character agency, and narrative control, and when we need to attenuate our player agency based on the knowledge and the context within which the character is operating. That in reality, what is probably of primary importance is the character's agency, that the character operates in a way that makes sense to it within that shared imagined setting. Anyway, as usual, I thank you very much for watching the video and sticking with it up to this point, and hope to see you again at the next one. Thank you very much.